We're here with Tom Scott, Green Party candidate for Truro and Falmouth. Hi, Tom.
Hi.
So what would you say is your key policy as a Green Party candidate?
Well, I think this election is really about two big things. The first is Brexit, and that's obviously the reason why the election was called. And it is something that I feel very strongly about. I think it's going to be hugely damaging, and certainly Boris Johnson's version of it will be especially damaging, probably leading to a no-deal Brexit eventually, which is something that I think we need to avoid at all costs. But the other huge issue for me in this election is climate. And I think it's also an issue with an awful lot of people whom I'm meeting on the doorstep. It's a top-of-the-mind issue, I think, for rising numbers of voters. And I think this is something that I'd like to keep absolutely at the front and centre of this election campaign.
Well, let's start with the election campaign itself.
Sure.
You've been an avid researcher and campaigner on the topic of disinformation in politics. Yes. What are your thoughts on this election so far, the campaign and how it's being run?
It's a really good question. There's certainly some very underhand stuff going on. We saw what the Conservative Party press office did with their Twitter accounts, which I think is absolutely disgraceful. There's also some very dodgy stuff, which I think hasn't been sufficiently covered by the mainstream media, being done by somebody called Thomas Borwick, who you may have come across. He was running digital operations for Vote Leave. He's now running a highly deceptive campaign for, I believe, for the Conservatives, although it's not branded as a Conservative campaign. He's putting out, for example, false advertising, pretending to be other parties, and aimed at marginal constituencies, encouraging people to vote for other parties.
Would you say that it's a problem exclusive to the Leave campaign and the Conservatives, or is it a full spectrum thing?
Well, I haven't come across that kind of deliberately deceptive social media disinformation from other parties. I think the same people who were behind the Vote Leave campaign are now working for the Conservative Party campaign. Dominic Cummings, of course, is Boris Johnson's most senior advisor, and he was very much at the heart of that massive disinformation campaign that went on in 2016.
Well, at the last election, the Greens won just 1.5% of the vote. How do you plan to appeal to voters this time round, and why shouldn't they vote Labour or Lib Dem?
Well, as I was saying, I think one big reason for that is because climate has become so much more important for so many people.
In 2 years?
Yeah, I think it has. I think we've seen a complete transformation in people's kind of understanding of what the climate emergency means and what needs to be done about it. And I believe that the Green Party's manifesto sets out some very clear, costed policies that show us a clear pathway to achieving net zero carbon by 2030. And from what scientists are telling us, that is absolutely necessary to do.
Well, just before we move on to the environment, I just want to talk a bit about the Remain alliance between the Greens and the Lib Dems. There are, in both constituencies we're covering, Truro and Falmouth and Camborne, Hale and Redruth, both Green and Lib Dem candidates. What's happening there?
Well, this was a national agreement. It doesn't cover every constituency. What's happened essentially is that the leaders of the Green Party and the Liberal Democrat Party have looked at the constituencies in which they think an alliance would make the most difference. There's been considerable kind of argument over which those might be, and I think possibly there are other constituencies in which it could make a difference, but essentially it's a national alliance, and we're following kind of national guidance on where we should or shouldn't be standing from our national leadership.
Is this constituency one which you think should have had this alliance implemented?
I'd like to have seen more alliances, but that wasn't what happened. And we've all agreed as candidates, not to stand down unless we get a clear lead on that from our national leadership.
Are you worried at all about splitting the Remain vote here? I mean, pretty much every seat in Cornwall until not too long ago was Liberal Democrat, and so you're kind of the underdogs in this situation.
I'm not worried about being a Green candidate and being able to put our Green Party policies to the electorate, because I think it's really important at this particular election that that happens widely.
Yes,
in Truro
but
Falmouth and other
if
places
you
as
are
well.
in this role of the splitter of the vote, is it not vote Green Party, get a Leave candidate, get a Conservative candidate?
Well, some people will certainly be voting tactically. Tactical voting is obviously going to play a big part in this election. That will be down to individual decisions. But I think it is important that the Green Party is standing in a very wide swathe of constituencies across the country. If we don't do that, we cease to become relevant as a party. And that's not why I'm standing as a Green candidate. I want us to be relevant, and I want climate change in particular to be at the heart of election debates in this constituency.
Well, let's talk about climate change and the environment a bit. The Greens are putting forward a new deal from the environment, the Green New Deal.
Yeah.
What would you say are the most important aspects of this for Cornwall and the South West?
Well, I think almost all of it, actually. It is a truly kind of transformative vision of what we should be doing with our economy.
If you had to give one policy?
I think housing is hugely important. In particular, our promise to create 100,000 new social homes, low carbon, low energy, and warm, properly insulated homes. That could be transformative in Cornwall, where we have a lot of people who can't afford proper housing at the moment.
Well, both Labour and the Greens are putting forward this Green New Deal, or a version of it. All the polling shows pretty much the Greens probably aren't going to win. Why shouldn't Green supporters vote Labour and get someone who can make a difference?
Well, it's up to individuals to make that decision. But
so you can't tell your voters why they shouldn't vote for Labour?
I would say that our manifesto is a much bolder and much stronger call to action on climate change.
Does that matter if you don't win?
I think it does matter, yes, because I don't think any of the parties would be talking in the way that they currently are about climate change were it not for what the Green Party has done in leading the way in that area. I think Labour has moved quite a long way in a positive direction. I think it's done that partly because it is afraid of losing votes to the Green Party. And I think it's right to be afraid of that, because people can see that we are actually offering something that is transformative, and Labour is doing its best to kind of catch up with us. I hope it goes further. I think it has quite a long way further to go.
I want to just zero in on certain aspects of the Green New Deal, and particularly the economics of it and the economic impact.
Sure.
So, first of all, the major headline policy of the Green New Deal is £100 billion of investment for funding the Green New Deal effectively, including tax incentives for businesses.
Right.
Where are we going to get the money?
Well, we've costed it all. If you've got to the end of the manifesto, you'll see that we've included detailed costings for that programme. Most of that, the capital investment programme, which I think is the one you're referring to, which is about 97.5 billion, I think, but effectively 100 billion. That's from public borrowing, and this is a good time to be making public borrowing because interest rates are historically low. And
still, 100 billion is a lot to borrow, surely.
Well, I think you need to look at this or think about it in the same kind of way as you think about a wartime situation. And if you think about the British economy on the eve of the Second World War, it might have seemed completely impossible to people then that the whole economy could be turned around in a matter of a few months, a year, to redirect it to the war effort. That's what happened. At that time, during the war, 52% of national GDP was being spent on the war effort. In equivalent terms, now that would be about £1 trillion a year, because our national GDP at the moment is about 2 trillion.
But then if we look at the post-war period, the amount of borrowing during the war caused successive economic crises throughout the 50s.
Well, it took quite a long time for the economy to kind of get back to what you might call normal conditions. But I would say that that was an effort that was well worth making. It's a different situation, of course, because what we're not saying is that we need to make a temporary effort and then return to things as they were before. That can't happen. So it is a very different situation in that respect. But the scale of the effort that's needed is certainly comparable.
Well, it seems to me, and perhaps to some of our viewers, that voting Green and getting this Green New Deal, while they may be concerned about the environment, seems like a recipe for skyrocketing national debt.
Well, it would certainly increase the national debt, and we're not making any bones about that. We think it needs to be increased, but we think there's a very good reason for doing that, as there was in the war, in fact.
Specifically on your Green New Deal for transport, there are two policies in there. First of all, the frequent flyer levy on people making more than one return flight a year, and also effectively a carbon tax to when you are using your car excessively, increasing taxes on...
Well, it's not just about cars, the carbon tax. It's on kind of all burning of fossil fuels.
But that includes using
it
cars,
would include,
presumably.
Yeah, of course.
So how much would that cost the average person and business people who have to fly or have to drive as part of their job?
Well, you say have to. I think an awful lot of flying is not actually necessary, and we do need to scale back drastically on aviation. Aviation is the fastest growing source of carbon emissions, and it makes no sense really to be proposing a Green New Deal aimed at getting to net zero carbon if we simply allow aviation emissions to continue as they are or increase. So yeah, it would mean that people were not able to fly as much. I think at the moment something like 15% of people take 70% of flights. There are people who are going on holiday abroad by plane, 4 times a year. That's just completely nonsensical, and that's something that we really want to stop.
Well, if the Greens were to get in, and either your leaders or your sitting MP, most senior sitting MP, Caroline Lucas, were to become the Prime Minister, they would have to travel up and down the country. They'd have to go and meet people. They'd have to run campaign events for the next general election. How would they travel? Would they have to pay this tax?
Well, you can fairly easily travel up and down the country by train, and I believe Caroline does quite a lot of that already. I don't think she does any domestic flying as far as I know. So I wouldn't see that as a particularly massive problem, and I certainly don't think she'd be kind of travelling around by helicopter as a lot of our political leaders do at the moment.
But might it not cost more to the taxpayer? For example, if she had to go over to Brussels, and that's a train to Dover, a train to Calais, a train to Brussels and back, as opposed to a flight or a car journey?
Well, I think if she were to become Prime Minister, then flying to Brussels would be quite a lot more expensive than going by train. So, no, I don't think so.
OK, well, I want to move on now to Brexit. As you said, this is a key issue in the election campaign. It's one of the major issues. The Greens are campaigning for a people's vote, unlike the Lib Dems, who are campaigning to revoke Article 50. If we get one, and we vote to leave again, will the Greens accept that result?
We would accept the result. We wouldn't obviously be happy about the result, but if that's what it were, we would.
Would you as a Green MP then vote a Brexit deal through Parliament?
Well, we'd have to look at the actual deal, and the point about a people's vote is that it would be on whatever deal was currently on the table. So,
but that deal would then have to go through Parliament.
It would have to go through Parliament, and if it were a Green government, I would expect it to be a very, very different deal from the kind of deal that Boris Johnson is proposing. OK,
but even if it's not a Green government, you're proposing a people's vote. If we get one under Labour, for example, which is the more likely scenario in terms of people's votes happening, would Green MPs then vote for the deal to go through, or would you accept the result but vote against the deal? So accept it but refuse to implement it.
You're talking about a vote on a Corbyn deal to leave. I think we would be under sort of no obligation to particularly support that deal, but we'd want to look at the deal as it was.
So you're saying you would accept the result of a referendum but then refuse to help implement it? Possibly.
It would depend on the deal, I think.
Finally,
But if Corbyn were to have a majority in Parliament, I would imagine that his deal, if it were approved by a people's vote, would go through anyway.
Okay, well, hypothetically, what sort of Brexit deal would you support?
I think there is no good form of Brexit, to be perfectly honest. I would accept the result of a people's vote, but I think
that there's no deal you'd vote for?
I can't imagine, really, that any deal is going to be better than the one we currently have, which gives us free trade, it gives us free movement.
Okay, well, just to go back to something you previously said there.
Yeah.
You mentioned if it was a Green government, it would be a very different kind of deal.
Yeah.
So if we had a people's vote, voted to leave, and there was a Green government, would they then come up with a Brexit deal, or would there be no deal that they could vote for?
Well, there would have to be some form of deal to vote on. To be honest, I don't think that any form of deal is likely to be very significantly different from the one that Theresa May was able to negotiate, because that kind of met all of the red lines on the EU side. We certainly wouldn't want the kind of deal which I think Boris Johnson is hoping for eventually, which would essentially move us out of alignment with the EU in as many ways as he can manage in order to come to some kind of very damaging trade deal with Trump. And we've just seen today that Trump is already insisting that there's a no-deal Brexit in order to get the kind of deal that the US actually wants.
So under a Green government, the people's vote would be effectively a choice between Theresa May's deal, which nobody wanted, and Remain.
It wouldn't be Theresa May's deal.
But something similar, as you said.
Well, we would try to get significant advantages. We'd certainly want, in fact, to remain in the customs union, to remain in the single market.
Oh, so it would be effectively Remain versus Remain?
No, not at all, because if you remember, during the 2016 referendum campaign, we were repeatedly promised by Michael Gove, by Boris Johnson and various other people that we would be remaining in the single market, and there'd be absolutely no need to leave the single market because we were leaving the EU. That is a possibility. We could leave some of the structures of the EU while remaining in the single market. I mean, I don't think there are any potential advantages to that arrangement, because effectively it would mean keeping within EU sort of strictures and regulations. I happen to think that they're mostly beneficial anyway, but we wouldn't have any say in the way that those were made if we weren't part of the EU Parliament, if we didn't have commissioners on the EU Commission. So to me, it would be completely nonsensical.
Okay, well, I'd just like to quickly move on to the proposed changes in the voting system. So first of all, you're promoting a vote for 16-year-olds and a change to proportional representation.
Yes.
Why is that?
Very briefly. I think an awful lot of people can see that the current system that we have, electoral system, means that many people feel that their votes simply don't matter. You were asking me about why some people feel that they can't vote Green. Well, that's one reason. And it's a very different thing if the votes cast are actually fairly reflected in the number of MPs representing people in Parliament. That's not the case at the moment, and that's the whole point of a proportional system.
Well, people in the UK are already suffering from tremendous amounts of voter fatigue. They're sick of hung parliaments and parliamentary gridlock. Would a more complicated proportional system, which involves far more coalitions, gridlock, and indecision in Parliament,
I think that's based on a false assumption that it's likely to lead to more coalitions or more gridlock. Look at just what's been happening in the past few years. We've had a minority government propped up by a tiny little party from Northern Ireland, bribed to do so by £1 billion. That's hardly a healthy system of government.
Well, that's exceptional political circumstances. But if
Not
you
at
look
all.
at,
We've had many coalition governments.
But if you look at an entirely proportional system such as Israel or Germany, they've barely ever had one-party governments. They entirely have coalitions. So every election is a hung parliament.
Germany seems to manage fine, to be honest. I don't think Germany has had more political problems than this country has, and I don't think those problems are to do with its electoral system.
Tom Scott, thank you very much.
Thanks.